Welcome back to the Describe Your World podcast. Today I'm really excited. I'm talking with a friend as well as a mentor. So this is one of my professors from college. Should I call you, is it weird to call you Professor Dendy? Should I call you Betsy?
Betsy's fine, yeah.
Okay. It's a weird question and every professor seems to respond to it differently. But we're talking to Betsy today, and we're going to talk about books and creativity and narrative voice and my experiences as a student, her experience as a teacher, and we'll see what all we get into. So happy to have you on. How are you feeling?
Doing well, thank you.
Good. What I like to start out with guests is kind of starting out with early life. So I'd like to hear a little bit about your origin story in a way, like if there's any formative experience that sort of informs who you are today. Anything like that would be cool. So whatever you feel good to talk about.
Okay. Well, I am a preacher's kid. My dad's a Methodist minister, mostly retired now. So I grew up moving back and forth a lot between the southwestern part of Virginia and East Tennessee, which was the conference he was in. So about every 4 years when I was a kid, we were moving. And that makes it a little hard. You know, you make friends and then you have to move somewhere else. So one of the things I found fairly early on that was definitely formative was the library. And so I actually tell this in class. So you may have heard me say in class that one of the things that I recall as knowing that I was destined to be an English lit major probably was in elementary school when I checked out Jane Eyre from the library, which I still marvel that my elementary school library had Jane Eyre. And I carried that book around and rechecked it week after week until I finally finished it. And I remember what it looks like, what it smelled like, it was just, I was very, walking around holding it all the time, just this book. Reading it now as an adult, I'm like, what in the world did I think about that story? I think I probably was drawn into it because of the early part when she's little and she goes to school and things like that. But then, it gets pretty adult by the end of the story, but I was determined to finish it. But I think that was one of the things that sort of put me on the trajectory. I love to read, and reading that kind of thing early on, I think was part of that. So I was interested in literature all through my high school, and reading was was important to me. But when I went to college, I wasn't sure what I was going to do. And I went to a junior college. So at first I was just a liberal arts major. So that meant I was doing theater. I was taking lit classes. I was doing music. So that was great. And I got my AA, and it was a liberal arts degree. But then I transferred to a 4-year school, to Emory and Henry College. And I was trying to figure out what to do. I had no clue. It's like, I don't really know what I'm going to, So I thought, okay, elementary ed, that sounds like that's a thing, right? I could do elementary ed. So I started in on that. And fortunately, one of the first semesters, they sent me to do observation in a kindergarten classroom. And I was just like, who are these little people and what are they doing? I don't belong here. So fairly quickly, I realized that was not the career path for me. And literally, I got out the college catalog and flipped through and marked classes that I thought sounded interesting, and then was like, well, if I did these, what kind of major could I have? And it was an English major. So I went and spoke to the head of that department, who had an office down in the bottom of the arts building, back behind all of this equipment that they used to do handset letterpress. And I found him there, books stacked up everywhere, and he leans back and puts his feet up on the table and says, so I hear you want to be an English major. And I was like, I have found my people. So that was great. I loved it. I got to do work there on the press, on their handset letterpress, where you learn how to set type out of the case, the little tiny pieces, and you set them all up. So that was a lot of fun. And so that's sort of the pathway that got me into then, doing grad work later in English and pursuing that as a teaching career.
Do you have, just out of curiosity, do you have any books still that you owned as a child that are the same books? Oh, that's cool.
I do. I actually also have a copy of The Witch of Blackbird Pond that is coming apart, but, taped together and has a rubber band around it because I won't get rid of it because it was one of the ones I had as a child. I have some from when I was really small, like picture books that my parents saved, but that's one of the first ones that I really loved. And my poor children, I had 3 daughters, and we read, at night, before bed, I would read to them or whatever. And I kept suggesting that book and and they weren't interested. And finally one of them was like, Mom, if we just read that book, will you hush? So I didn't get to pass along the love of that particular book, although most of my kids are readers.
Yeah, there are a few that I've had since I was really little. Obviously, that same value wouldn't come through from rereading them because they're picture books or children's books. But I don't know. I'm a little bit of a hoarder. I mean, if you can't tell from what's in my room, this is a lot of my childhood is still here. So I'm definitely someone who retains things. And books, I still feel the same way about physical copies of books. Like there's something about the smell and the feel. And they're a little easier to read for me than like an ebook. Although I do think it's cool that I can travel, and if I were to go on a plane or if I'm in my car, I can whip out an e-reader and read that way, and you can highlight and do cool things. But I don't know, that books have always been really special for me too. And I think going into college, even in my 2-year program, getting my Associate of Arts, I think that I knew that it would be literature that I would pursue right from the beginning. And I think that I sort of picked that up in high school just because I loved poetry and short stories. And there were a few novels I was really into. So it's funny because out in the workforce now, I don't do anything with literature, but what I love about it is I can still write, I can still create, I can still read, and that doesn't conflict with my career. So that's something that's interesting about lit. I don't know what would you do if you couldn't teach lit or writing?
Oh, I've thought about, library or bookstore. I mean, library is changing pretty dramatically now. So I think my image of being a librarian and wandering around in the stacks is probably, incredibly antiquated. But also, I think about people who work in bookstores who, recommend books to people. And I probably have an idealized version of that too. But I think that kind of thing, working with books would be fun. It's really hard though, because I've taught, except for the years that I took out when my kids were small, and with 3 that were very close together, it was like, well, I'm going to be the daycare for a while because that's just cheaper. But other than that, that's always been my job, has been teaching in an academic setting. So I'm used to that routine and that schedule. And I've thought about how hard it would be to shift to a schedule where you didn't have the flow of the academic year. And I work in the summer. I mean, people ask me at times like, well, yeah, it must be nice having the summers off. And I'm like, well, it's not exactly how that goes, but it's just different. I'm not teaching most of the time in the summer, but the semester and the academic year have their flow. I mean, from being a student that there's just sort of the crunch times and then the nicer times, the slack off times or whatever. And then it's done, I mean, you finish a class and yay. And then you get the fresh feeling of starting a new thing. And so I've liked that aspect of the job a lot. And it would really be hard to get used to something that wasn't in that format after having taught for as long as I've taught.
I wonder, I know that part of obviously teaching English involves grading papers and projects and the things that students have to submit to you just to show that they've at least done something to account for the courses that you're trying to teach something about. So what is it like for you to have to go through that sort of monotony of reading papers? Maybe you've read the same time hundreds of times.
That is the hardest part. I quote one of my professors from my undergrad who always said, I would teach for free. They have to pay me to grade. And that's absolutely true. I mean, there's just no way around it when you're teaching something like literature or the kinds of classes that I teach in general. There's that grading is just a chore. I was laughing. I was in touch with one of my office mates from Clemson, where I was working on graduate work. And I commuted. So when I needed to stay over, I would stay with her sometimes. And we used to get together with our piles of freshman essays that we had from being graduate assistants, and we would dump out a bag of M&Ms in the middle of the table. And every time you graded a paper, you got an M&M, and it was total bribery of yourself. I will grade these papers. But even now, I mean, as long as I've been doing it, I think, man, why am I not getting faster at this? You'd think after these years I would be faster, but it's still just a chore sometimes. And I think part of what makes it exhausting is that if you're going to do a good job at it, every single paper is different. Every one you pick up is a new thing. And I'm trying to give it the attention of this person took time to write this. So what can I say to be helpful to make that a better paper? And so it's a lot of energy that goes into that, aside from the fact that you just have to make yourself do it sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
You just like, I don't feel like grading papers all weekend. So that is a hard part. I mean, I like the planning. I get caught up in the researching of stuff when I'm teaching something I haven't taught, or, like I want to refresh on a piece that I've maybe taught a lot of times. That part's fun. I can really just disappear into that. And I love being in the classroom, the energy of students and the back and forth and all. But there's just nothing fun about the grading. If there is, I haven't found, other than M&Ms.
I wonder, one thing, because I taught for a couple of semesters at a technical college, and they were remedial writing classes because I didn't have the education required to teach anything transferable. So they were like 032s and 100s. And most of it was grammar and just trying to refine their ability to put sentences and paragraphs together. But I find myself caring very little about the content and a lot more about their ability to write. And I wonder if it's different for you from that literature perspective. Do you harp on the content, or are you more concerned about just getting polished writing out?
It depends on, because I teach composition as well as teaching literature. And so I think when I'm reading papers that are written for a lit class, I'm looking for something different there. I mean, obviously, if it's really poor grammatically, I'm going to mark some things and say some things, but in that kind of paper, I'm looking for ideas. What have you done? And that's not to say comp papers aren't about the ideas, but I think that the sense of that is you're in this class because I'm supposed to be giving you tools to help make you a better writer. And in order to do that, I can't just talk about the content. I also need to talk about, how are you structuring? How are you, what kind of language are you using? And that's gotten, in some ways, all the time we're talking about, the students are just, more difficult than they were, or they are less prepared or whatever. And we've been saying things like that ever since I've been teaching, But I think part of what happens is now I find myself talking a lot more with students about writing situation, sort of a rhetorical analysis approach of it's great if you can use text language when you're texting with your friends, but what's the writing situation that we're in, for an essay? And why might we not want to use that language? And I think there's some complicated things there. I try to read things about, not trying to squelch people's natural way of speaking in what they write, but also trying to make a distinction for them that whether it's right or wrong in the bigger picture of the system, that you're going to be expected to be able to write in a certain kind of way in certain situations. And you need to learn to do that, even if that's not the way you would normally speak. And I feel really conflicted about that at times, but there is more of the need to do the things with, because of the way they get used to writing with messaging and texting and all. But on the other hand, I say this at the beginning of the comp classes that, the students now are doing a tremendous amount of writing every day in a way that people my age weren't doing, because we weren't texting and messaging and emailing all the time, so if you looked at word count, if you had like a Fitbit that tracked your words for the day or whatever, that most of these students would be really writing a lot. They're just not writing in the academic situation as much, most of the time. So
I wonder too, and it poses an interesting question, because the world has changed so much, and we have things like TikTok and text messaging and all of these extremely brief blinks of content, if you will. Like you have something for 10 or 15 seconds and then you move on to the next thing. So I wouldn't say that writing properly or with good punctuation and grammar has lost value, but I would say that there are just so fewer situations where they're required to do that. It's, if I send you a text message and just put a smiley face, that's totally fine. You don't really need a paragraph, although I could give you that. So I wonder if that would evolve over time and change, or if that formal, clean, polished writing will always have the same value.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I don't have a good answer because I think that, and that's a concern for the academy, right? It's like, we're going to keep teaching this stuff. How can we explain the value of what we're trying to teach? And so I do think that effort in comp classes in particular to try to make what we call real world applications, to what if you were writing this in this kind of situation? What if this were a memo at work? So I do think, some of that, you can make the argument that, okay, you need to be able to write in these kinds of ways. But I think the way that language evolves over things like TikTok and texting is fascinating. It's like, okay, do we need periods? Well, I'm going to hit return or send at the end of every main idea. So does it matter if I have a period? Maybe not. And we can use smiley faces, like you said. I don't have to write out, oh, I'm feeling very happy today, because we've got that. So I try to read a lot of that stuff and try to stay at least a little bit up with, periods are passive aggressive, don't put periods at the end of there. That kind of changes that are happening in terms of texting language, I think, are really interesting. How that connects into the classroom is, always a challenge, I guess.
I think it's very cool too, because it's kind of similar. If I were to write a paragraph in cursive, I think the majority of people, as long as they have a strong understanding of print, could probably read it, just because the shapes are fairly similar. I think that's pretty true about, like, from text to like reading a novel as well. Like, as long as you have a basic reading ability, you can go in and put all the ideas together. I think the challenge is, I think novelization has to be stronger, and I think you have to have an attention getter closer to the front, because obviously with TikTok and shorts and reels, if you don't get the attention immediately, then book's going to be put down. So probably changes the way people are writing and crafting pieces of work, just because you need to have enough of an impact right at the front to get someone not to put the book down.
And I think in terms of story, you're right. But it's also interesting you mentioned that about cursive, because I had a student, I don't know, sometime in the last couple of semesters who asked me, could I teach him to sign his name in cursive, because that's not something he had learned to do. On the other hand, I have a number of international students, and for some of them, they have to ask me to print more carefully when I'm commenting on their papers, because it's really hard for them to read. I have sort of a connected printing. I don't write in cursive, but I connect letters, some of the letters when I print, and they can't recognize the characters very well for that, particularly with some like Japanese students and that. So I have to be very aware of that. So not only the like story formation and the hook and those things, but the actual literal process of the writing has implications in the classroom. So
I wonder too, and we can kind of transition to more like topical ideas after this, but my last kind of classroom related question. So I know as a student, my experience was that a lot of classes you had 3 or 4 people who are really engaged with the content, and then you had 10 to 15 plus who weren't engaged and really just needed that credit or that elective or whatever. And so you have people who are really wanting to give you essays and projects and papers that have new ideas and have important things to say. And then you have people who just want to give you what you want to read so that they can get an A or a B or whatever. So I'm wondering if that's changed any, or if you're noticing anything with, people coming through now, or if that's still the trend.
I think it's still the trend. I think there are always going to be people who are going to go above and beyond. I'm not naming any names, Travis, but But yeah, so you've got people in a class who are engaged in the ideas and they're just soaking it up and they want to, get into it more deeply. And then you've got, like you said, those folks who are just trying to meet a requirement. Um, and I do think that poses challenges in the classroom. I think it's always going to. We're talking constantly about engaging. How do we engage students? We had a faculty member who recently did a workshop on Kahoot, talking about how to use some of those things. I went to the teaching professor conference over the summer in Atlanta, which was fascinating because it literally focused on professors who teach. It was all sorts of topics related to that. So that's constantly trying to figure out what you do with those kinds of situations when a classroom splits like that, and you could could we just have this group over here and we'll have a conversation, and these folks over here who aren't really interested. And I think part of it, we also had some after the pandemic when people had been, after the lockdown, after remote learning, when people had been online so much. Sometimes being in the classroom felt like sitting in front of a Zoom screen with people who just had, their name on their block. They were like not there in some ways. And I think it's taken a while to get students back into the thing of, it can be fun to talk about some of this stuff or to write about some of these things. So I think that, those are challenges that probably going to always be a part.
Of course. So one thing that I think is really interesting, and I think something that kind of connects us in a way still, is that there were a couple of courses that I had the privilege of doing in college that were like one-on-one, essentially. Like we did, I think we did Dickinson and Whitman one-on-one. I'm pretty sure we did, because I think I did a couple of online related things for that.
Right, you did.
So I'm curious. Well, let's start with Dickinson, because I know Dickinson is like top 3, top 5. She's a favorite of yours. So where did your love for Emily Dickinson come in?
Oh, wow. That's a really good question. I don't know that I've ever thought about when did I start loving her in the way that I love her now. I did study her, of course, in undergrad. I mean, she was one of the few women that you studied, might study extensively at that time. Fortunately, now we study a lot more different women than we did when I was coming through there. But I think she's been just so fascinating in so many ways because she is so malleable to people's interests, I think. And so the fact that you can't pin her down, even in the poetry or in her letters or in her life. There are just all these questions, and so I think that drew me in fairly early when I started reading her. But her use of language is just gorgeous. I love the play on words. I've always been a word person. I've always thought that was fun to think about different meanings of words. And the fact that with her, I can read a poem that I've read over and over and over. And then I can look up a word and be like, wonder what the different meanings of that are. And then I find a meaning and I'm like, oh man, if I think about it meaning that, then it changes everything about this poem. Or I could read it this way too. So I think that part I've always really, really appreciated about her, that it's a puzzle, it's a challenge. But I also love the fact, and I'm sure we talked about this in the class, that she can take what feels like it might have been a personal experience, although she writes with personas a lot, so you never really know. But you could take something that felt like that, and she would write about it in a way that seemed to have some of specific kinds of details in it. But it was such a universal description of an experience that you could have an experience of your own that was miles away from anything she would have ever had, and this poem fits it. And so I think that's part of her lasting power too, is that she can write the specific in such a universal way that you can just apply it to yourself. I did think, this is a little off your question, but I have thought many times, as I just recently got to watch Apple TV's Dickinson series, thought about you and thought, oh man, if we just had this when you were doing that class, think of all the things we could have talked about and done. because that definitely sent me back into research mode. I'd be watching and I'd be going like, I don't think that's what happened, and I'd go back and research it. What do we know about what happened in this situation? Have you seen that?
So I don't have anything on Apple TV. So, but I will say though that even if I had it available, I don't know what it is about Haley Steinfeld, but when I look at her, there's not a connection that I want to be there. So I'd probably have to watch it to really make a judgment call. But I think having Emily's poetry for me is just better. I don't know. I don't know if I want to see it in television form, but I don't know.
To watch it just because I'm so fascinated with Dickinson. I've read a number of the biographies and other books about her, and I was just curious about how are they going to handle it. Was I going to watch it and just hate it and be like, what have you done? And it is something to get used to, because it's one of those where it's in the time period and the costumes are nice and everything. But it feels modernized in a lot of ways, that the language and sort of the way they interact. But one thing that did was really remind me, and I think this applies to that Whitman Dickinson class we had too, that by the time we get to these writers, we think of them as older. Mm-hmm. Right. So to imagine her as a teenager, to go back and be like, okay, if we take these personality traits that we see in the poems and the letters and we put that into being an angsty teenager, what would that be like? And I was like, yeah, I can see how some of what they're doing here captures a little of that, even though it at first I was like, why is Emily doing that? So I think that's interesting. And they did take some liberties, I would look stuff up and I would be like, yeah, that's not how that went down. And then of course there are things that we don't know how they happened, so that didn't bother me so much when they took liberties with some of those things. But just the fact that they were getting her poetry out there again, that it was a really central part of each episode was to have, some piece of her poetry. So I thought that was really a fascinating thing. And I'm not always a fan of some of the revised kinds of shows. I mean, some of the Austen movies have not been great. Those kinds of things. But I certainly respect your position. Don't mess with Emily in her pure form, because it's never going to be as good as what you can get just reading the poems.
There's something really cool about her the fact that I think we talked about it in the class, but Whitman has so many words, and usually they're words that are filling out the detail of sort of a specific idea or something important that he's trying to talk about. And then Dickinson's the inverse, where there are few words, but there's a lot to unpack and play with in those few words. So I think it's cool because now, as we get more into this society of TikTok and Reels and Shorts and things like that, I think she's going to be even more impactful and maybe more intriguing to readers, because you don't have to spend as much time just to get through a poem. You can read the poem and then come back to it later, think about it, contemplate it. But just the time commitment is far less, for a lot of her stuff, and not in a way that, Plath would be. Plath has really long stuff. Whitman has long stuff. And a lot of poets do that, but I think, and then there's all the playful capitalization. There's the playful punctuation. One of my good friends was one of my professors at community college, and I loved using the dash. So that was my big thing when I would write essays. I would always have a dash somewhere, and he would be like, all right, there's your little, he would put ED if he put a comment on it. And he would say, that's your little Emily Dickinson mark. So there are little things that I pull from her too, but just stylistically, I think that she's modern before modernity.
Well, no doubt in my mind that she is one of the most influential. I mean, that's part of the reason that we had that set up with, Whitman and Dickinson as the two for that class, to look at how did he influence a certain kind of thing in writing, but how did she, and yeah, you're right. I mean, and she was doing modern stuff and imagist stuff, and people, look, when they finally had access to her, looking back and going, wow, how was she doing this? And I do, like I said, it's like a puzzle. I love the fact that they're just these tiny little poems, and you read them and you're like, oh, okay, I'm done reading that. And then you go, oh, no, wait, I'm not, because what about this? What about this? There's just so many different as she would say, I dwell in possibility, right? So, yeah, so I really like that aspect of her, and I just think the enigmatic nature of it is, like I said, part of what keeps her fresh, keeps people coming back to her because you just can't know. And I'm, I sometimes am unfair to Whitman because he's my less favorite of those. But I mean, Whitman just wants to tell you everything, right? I mean, he wants to tell it in many, many different ways and make you a big long list of it. And, but it's like, okay, well, I get it, and I know there's much, much more going on with him than that, but I do appreciate her compactness as a poet.
One thing that I really love, and it's something that I really discovered more with Plath than Dickinson, but I'm looking back now, I see it more that Dickinson also did it. But I love when writers scribble on little napkins or little notes, and they'll send things in the mail, and we recover that stuff so many years later and see, oh, this poem was originally found in a letter, or this was originally transferred via a little like Post-it note to someone and things like that. So it makes me sad, but it also intrigues me a lot that a lot of pieces that have been written have been transferred that way and are just lost to time because they belong to one person and they'll be in a drawer or a box.
Well, and Dickinson, I mean, for sure. I don't know if you've ever seen, I may have brought into the class that book that's called, I think it's Gorgeous Nothings. That's a facsimile of a bunch of the little pieces, right? I mean, it's like the torn off part of an envelope or the back of a receipt, and so they have pictures of those, and then the text is written out beside because sometimes you can't read her handwriting very well. But that idea, of just whatever was to hand, and she had an idea, she wanted to jot it right down. But the other thing about her, I think that touches on is that concept of her self-publication, that, because she didn't end up publishing in the standard ways of her time, what she wrote in the letters to people was a kind of publishing, but also the way she manipulated things on the page. So I've seen, and I'm sure we talked about, arguments that you should never read Dickinson except in manuscript, because you need to see how did she have different lengths of dashes, and how did she arrange things on the page in a way that you can't really duplicate that in printed text. And I'm not a purist to that extent, it's hard, and I think it would be hard to read everything that way. But I do think it's a fascinating idea that not only was she doing this writing, but she was deciding how to represent it on the page because it wasn't being represented in print. So, I mean, I think that's another cool aspect of the mystery of Dickinson.
We'll have to come back at some point and do a follow-up episode and just kind of do the Whitman Dickinson debate and make that the theme of the episode, just because it's still very fresh. I still have the books. I could go back and piece some of that together. But I will say before I move on from Emily, I like to throw out, just for anyone listening, some recommendations, because I'd really love for people to give her a shot, try a couple poems. So for me, just a couple that come to mind. Hope is a Thing with Feathers has always been one of my favorites. The Loaded Gun poem, I can't remember the title.
My life is a loaded gun. Yeah.
There you go. That one's probably my number one. But what about you? Is there anything that you would encourage to try it out?
Some of the more common ones that I'm a fan of, I do like the After Great Pain, a Formal Feeling Comes. That's a I think very apt one. And there's a Certain Slant of Light. That's one of my favorites too. But I discovered, I don't know if I'm sure I've mentioned this to you too. It's been a while since we were in that class, but I had done just a personal project where I took the collection of her poems and read one every day and wrote, just little notes to myself. I didn't let myself research it most of the time. Like occasionally I could look up a word, but I wasn't allowed to look up what other people said about the poem. So I was just writing things that I thought about it as I read it as a reader. Because, I mean, how many in a class even, that was half the class devoted to Dickinson, how many poems did we get through? Nothing compared to what she's got. So I thought, well, there are all these ones I've never read. So it took me a little over 5 years reading one every day, and taking the notes about it. And in that process, I discovered one that's called We Grow Accustomed to the Dark. And it is one of my favorites of hers now. I just think she gets it. So that's a favorite.
What is it, like 1800? I think somewhere around there that she has published. Okay. So yeah, 5 years, that's a journey, but it's worth it. I mean, and it's not a huge time commitment, and it might be time commitment if you want to learn like every line, but
Yeah, but just to read it. Yeah. I mean, and I thought about going back and using the same book and doing it again, like
mm,
looking at what did I say then and read it again and think, well, what other notes would I have now? I've also tried a little bit to memorize some of her things just because I think it's a good practice, it's a good brain exercise, but it's nice to have some of those things in my head. But also I notice it's really difficult to memorize some of her stuff because she uses very similar rhythms and line lengths and stanza, forms most of the time. And so sometimes it's easy to feel like you're just moving, like, wait, oh no, that was from another poem. That line, it was almost like doing refrigerator poetry or something, it's like, let's put these lines together and see what we come up with.
my wife showed me a TikTok a couple weeks ago, and I thought about recording with you because I knew it would be relevant. But someone took, because she has such a standard meter in a lot of poems, someone took the Pokemon theme song and swapped out her poetry with the lyrics, and it lined up perfectly. And I was like, see, she knew a long time ago, pop music. This was the meter.
Yeah. It would have been interesting to have seen how she would have adapted to this time period and what kind of writing she would have done in this time.
Yeah.
I always think personally she would have been an exhausting friend. I mean, so smart and just so constantly intense, it seems like, and I can see that other people would have felt like, how do I keep up with this? How do I respond?
So let's talk a little bit about gender studies. So that's another big part of you and your role as a teacher and an instructor. So definitely wanted to start with a little bit of a personal anecdote. So I like to tell people this because I think it's really funny and cute in a lot of ways. But when I was a lit major, one of my upper lit classes was women's lit. And so it's very cool because when we started the class, I think it was maybe like 14, 15 students in the class, but there were only two guys. It was me and one other. And then after week one, it was just me. So I always think it's really fun to say that I stuck it out. I survived. I went through it. I learned. I absorbed. But I was the only guy who was willing to go through it. So what is it about gender studies, and when did that become such a significant, piece of what you teach?
It actually started for me in graduate school, although at the time that I was doing graduate work at Clemson, there was no women's studies or gender studies program. But I just happened to fall into a class on major British women writers. And the woman who was teaching it, who then ended up being my thesis director at Clemson, was very interested in women's writing. And she was actually one of the people who then went on to help start the women's studies program at Clemson after I had left. So having those classes with her was, I think, and also thinking back to undergrad where, like I said, there weren't many women in the things that I read. So then I was starting to read these women and I was like, oh, wow, and this was also close to the time that we were getting some of the really good, like feminist criticism in literary form. Gilbert and Gubar and Elaine Showalter and people like that were writing some really interesting things. So I started getting into it by way of lit. And that sort of set me on a pathway of still within literature, like teaching the women writers class, and focusing on trying to include more women in the other kinds of surveys and things that I was doing. And so that really did lead me more and more into being interested, not just in the literary criticism that was focused on feminism, but looking more broadly at women's studies, which it was women's studies at the time when I first started getting interested in it. So while after I had come to St. Andrews, I had, with a couple of other folks there, we got together and decided, we wanted to start a women's studies program, which at that point, and still now, we have a minor. I mean, we don't have enough faculty in that area to put together a major right now. But so I came at it definitely by way of lit. That was my door into women's studies. But once I got started with it and began to read more, study more, talk more with people, think about the program we were doing, start to teach the program we were doing, and eventually then did a certification to so that I was certified to teach some of the other stuff in the program. That just, it really grabbed me in terms of how it, because I was interested in pop culture. I was interested in all kinds of things where that was just such an important factor, was to think about it. And then as I was in it for a while, then things began to shift, not so much just to focus on women's studies, but beginning to focus on gender studies, which I think has been, a necessary and very interesting refocusing. But it's also been sort of odd for me because I came to it because of my strong feelings about women's writing and women's roles and things. And then it was like, oh, we're going to talk about men too, but that makes total sense to me. I see what we're doing now in terms of gender studies as you've got to talk about everybody's gender in order to see how this picture fits together and how it's changing and evolving and what people think about it. So there's always interesting stuff to be reading and pondering and bringing into class. And that's part of what I love about those classes is that I think sometimes with the lit classes, you've got people who are like, okay, I need to meet a humanities requirement. I guess I'll take this lit, but they may not have much background in lit. So they feel sort of intimidated about, I don't know who she's talking about right now, or I've never read that thing, or I have no context for this. But with the gender studies classes, once people get in there and you start talking, they realize, well, they live with this, right? Everybody lives with this. So everybody has context and perspective and things to contribute in that conversation without feeling like, they've got to catch up, figure out the language. There's terminology and stuff, but so I think that's been a fun part for me about teaching those classes, and they've done really well. They've been, pretty popular, which is, I'm glad, because I think it's information that people need to be talking about. But I really work to try to keep it grounded in the history and grounded in the sort of classic pieces, but also, what's happening right now. Hey, this article this morning from the New York Times, I'm bringing that in. We're using that for class. So it's possible with that to keep, and, TikTok videos. I do a lot of things where I ask students, once we've talked about a topic, to find something that's in their world, and bring it in and let's talk about it. So it's TikTok videos, it's memes, it's song lyrics, it's pieces of a TV show, it's, whatever. There's something they saw in Walmart, they'll bring it in and we'll talk about it. Yeah. Okay. What does that have to say about gender and society and how we think about it? So I just think it's really important, and I think it's sort of limitless, the ways in which you can bring in student interests to that. And so we've had success with the minors, and the way that works for us is that it's sort of an interdisciplinary minor, because there are a set number of GS classes, but then beyond that, people take courses like history classes that might focus on women, or an art class where they would look at how gender is represented in art, or something like that can count as part of the minor. And so that means we've got people from all kinds of different majors who are taking the minor, and the final project for that minor is to combine those things. So what is your major? Okay, now how is the information in the gender studies minor connected to what you're doing for your major? So there've been all kinds of really interesting things that students have done for their projects. Some of them very practical. One of the young women was an art major, and so she focused on looking at what were some of the things she needed to think about and do as she began to develop her career in order to get, showings, to get, taken seriously in the art world. So it was a very practical project for her, getting ready to go out and try to market her art. And sometimes it's more theoretical kinds of stuff, but I've just been really pleased to hear things like one of the young women was and we have many men who do it too. As not as many maybe as the women, but there are a good number of men who have done that minor. But she had done a science related topic, and that's part of what she used in her application stuff for the grad school program that she's in now. So, I was like, yay, get into grad school. I think that's part of why I've just been so drawn into it. Is because it grew out of other things I loved in the literature world, but it just is, it's so important, I think, and so applicable to everybody's experiences.
Yeah, there was when people ask me why did you choose literature? Why did you want to pursue that as a major? Like, did you intend to teach? Because the normal assumption is if you're a lit major, you want to be a teacher. So a lot of times I talk about my love for history and my love for understanding what happened so that we don't repeat some of that stuff. But literature is a different type of history. It's like your personal narrative. Like this is like the firsthand, first person perspective of things that occurred. So it's a more powerful, more effective, more conversational form of history. And I think obviously you can change with narrative voice, you can make anything the way you want it to be in any situation. But memoirs, biographies, short stories that are framed with person story in mind, all those things are so important because they really paint a picture in a way that just a history book can't, So I think that really ties into the gender studies really well because, now we're in the modern world, gender is such a huge topic and it's such an important, relevant, current topic that's sort of at the forefront of a lot of important conversations. So that firsthand perspective and those firsthand narratives are going to be extremely relevant now. Now we need to understand, how did we get to this point? Why is this person framed or shaped the way they are? And that's kind of the answer. Like, well, why is literature so important? I think that's a big part of it. It's an account that you really can't get anywhere else.
I agree, and I think that I also am fascinated reading books about books or books about reading or language development. I mean, I mean like fictional books that deal with things about a library or a language system or story or narrative. I love the stuff about like narrative perspective. It's like, whose story is this, and why are they telling it this way? And yeah, that definitely ties into to looking at some of the gender study stuff, that we all are telling our story in a very particular way because of the gendered experiences that we have. But I love to, dig into experimental narrative styles and, read those things and see how somebody's doing stuff like, oh, wow, that just happened. So yeah, I read pretty broadly, partly because of that, that I'm fascinated with narrative voice and with what the actual physical process of reading, what does that accomplish? What does that do? How do we play around with it?
Yeah, years ago, whenever MySpace was still sort of a thing, one of my instructors was talking about we're sort of transitioning into this selfie generation, because everything's about the self, everything is about me. And then obviously later we get like Me Too movement, we get Black Lives Matter, we get all these important things. And so it's that first person perspective and the narrative voice is underlying pretty much everything, like everything from a short 10-second video with something important to say to a movie, the way that a story is portrayed in film, through books, newspapers, media, everything, I think. And it all really comes back to the same concept, is that you have to decide what part of that narrative you want to trust. Do you believe that what that person's saying, do you think it's influenced a certain way? How important is it or connected to your own experience? And I think that's what people are missing out on whenever they pass on like literature, because that's the other side of, it's an entertaining story. Cool. That's great. There are characters, but how do you relate to it and where do you place yourself in the story? So it's it's kind of like the tip of the iceberg thing where you can see part of it, but then there's this huge piece underneath that, you can choose whether to explore or not.
Well, and I think, as you're saying that, I'm thinking, well, yeah, that concept of who's telling the story and whether you trust them and why are they telling it. I mean, that's trying to figure out how to understand the news cycle, right? I mean, that's trying to understand, is this fake news or is this, is this real? Is this, why is this being framed to me in this way? And how is that changing? And social media, of course, has a huge hand in that, I think, of framing things in very specific ways to control the narrative, which I think is really interesting. And then of course we got that whole AI situation now, controlling the narrative. I'm not exactly sure, but I think that does raise some fascinating possibilities about, who tells stories.
Mm-hmm.
Apparently.
Yeah, I think it's really awesome too that just the way that the world has evolved and changed and shifted, and the fact that if you look back, and literature is a great example, the main avenue that we had for or discovering a person like a minority or a woman's experience was through some type of written narrative that they may have shared or put in a box or in a cabinet or something, and weren't able to publish, unfortunately, but we still have those pieces to connect together to understand what that picture looked like. And now we live in a society in which that's not so much the case. Like now anyone can share their voice, anyone can express, anyone can put that story forward. It's just a matter of how is it received and twisted and molded and shaped by the powers that be. But at least it's out there, and at least it's available for us to interpret and to pull things from.
I think there are still really interesting issues, though, about whose voices are heard. I mean, and I think that's true in publishing. Like I've read some fascinating things about why certain people have been so successful in publishing, and others who may be equally good have not. And so that's, like you were saying, there's the issue of what gets saved and what doesn't, what gets found and what doesn't, but then also what hits at the right time that it becomes popular and what doesn't, and it's like, well, but all that stuff I didn't get to read, right? Because it never got found, or it never got published, or it never got listened to. So, yeah.
Yeah, just imagine if something like, what if the Beatles never got played on the radio? Like, where would we be?
Have you seen that movie?
Which one?
I'm going to forget the name of it. The one where something happens, there's like a blip in the timeline and nobody remembers.
Oh, right. And the guy has all the music.
Yeah, he starts playing all their music and everybody's like, oh, he's so great. He's so great. Yeah. I have to go back and look that up and add that into your little notes for the show, because I'm not going to remember the title of it.
Yeah, I will. I'll put a little pop-up or something, or I'll put a footnote. But I don't know. It's painful and bittersweet in a way, because we know that there are a lot of stories that won't ever be shared, and all we have to go off of are the ones that are. So it's a constant struggle of how do we get everyone's story to the forefront, especially the extremely relevant ones to who we are and how we're growing and evolving and changing. I know that you have to go soon, so I want to, before I let you go, what I like to do with my guests, I have a series of 10 questions. I don't know if you have seen Inside the Actor Studio from the 90s. It was like a conversational, kind of like a podcast, but it was a TV show.
Okay.
But he always concluded the interview with a series of 10 questions. Might have been edited for content because a little of them are a little bit racy. But if you're down, we can play.
Try. I'm sometimes not very good at making a decision about something, but we'll see how it goes.
There you go. Off the top of the dome, whatever comes to mind. What's your favorite word?
Oh, golly. Enigma. That's going to be my word for the day.
It just makes me think of the Riddler. I don't know what his name is. Something Enigma. What is your least favorite word?
Oh, I don't think I can say that one on. No.
I can bleep it.
I don't like the word puke. That's one I can say, right? That's a gross word. Ugh.
What is that? Is it onomatopoeia, words that sound like the sound or whatever? Yeah. Puke just makes me think of it.
Yeah.
What excites you?
A new book. A book I've been waiting to read.
What upsets you?
Oh, people that don't listen to each other.
What sound or noise do you love?
I like the wind in the trees. It's very relaxing.
Very peaceful.
Except if it's a storm, then I'm not liking that at all. That's the flip side. I'm terrified now after hurricanes.
Again, is presentation, just like with literature, of what type of wind and what type of trees.
Exactly. That just fit right in with the theme.
Mm-hmm. What sound or noise do you hate? I guess, you could answer the same way, but...
Yeah, the screechy on the chalkboard thing is pretty high, because I have to try to avoid that, in class.
Yeah, I can imagine. I didn't even think about that as an instructor. What if you accidentally and then half the kids wake up and you know that you made a really bad noise? What motivates you to act every day when you wake up?
My dog, actually, let's be honest, the fact that I've got to get up and go take her out, she gets me up. No, that's, yes. I mean, that's a reasonable answer, but yeah. But I like getting up and doing what I'm doing most of the time.
Hmm. What profession other than your own would you like to try?
Wow, that's a tough one to think about. What would I like to do? I do think I would like to work in a bookstore. I think I would want to try that just because it'd be around the books all the time. It'd be like, I don't know, maybe it would make me get tired of books. I don't know. That's
We
possible.
just, I don't know how connected you are to the show, but we just watched the first part of season 4 of You on Netflix. So maybe not that kind of bookseller. um, let's see. What profession would you not like to do?
I don't want to. What do I not want to do? I don't want to make widgets. I don't want to be on an assembly line. I'm too old for that now. My body can't handle it.
And last question, always the most interesting to me. If heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
um, I'm sure there's something about like all my family being there or whatever, but probably like here's the library.
Or maybe he just gives you the key. He's like, you're hosting, you're taking care of the books.
This is your thing now.
Cool. Well, I'm not going to keep you any longer. I do really appreciate you coming on and talking. Definitely have to do it again. It's nice to talk to you again. It's been such a long time.
Have this time. I miss you in class.
And I will say that for people who, struggle with their classes, their instructors, their education experience, I think teachers are communicators, and as long as teachers are communicating well and care about the content they're communicating, then suck it up and do your best. Stop complaining.
There you go.
Be nice to teachers, in other words.
Yes.
But I'll let you have the final word. You say whatever you'd like to say, and then we'll wrap.
Well, I don't want to make you uncomfortable, but I would say that if students would be students like you were a student, then it would be great to, being a teacher would be easier all the time because you challenged me and made me think and pushed me in some really interesting ways that I appreciated. And so it's the students, right? I mean, that's it. That's why we do it. It's the students.
Absolutely. All right.